Welcome, everyone. My name is Asim I Khwaja. I'm the Director for the Center for International Development at Harvard University. Welcome, all of you. I know it's different time zones for different people, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining us. This is the fourth in a series, Beyond COVID series that CID has been running. I encourage you to watch previous recorded versions of it, and also welcome you to join subsequent ones as well. Today, I'm just thrilled to have three really amazing individuals joining us. Each one of them have done tremendous work on social protection, both as researchers, but also as people who have very much engaged with and been in the world of practice as well. Look, as much as we'd like to hope COVID to be over, the reality is that many countries are still struggling with the pandemic. And in many ways, the effect of the pandemic is going to stay with us for years to come. For us, while the pandemic has generated massive upheaval and loss, it is also an opportunity for us to rethink and reconsider. In many ways, the pandemic has revealed some of the fault lines in our own systems. And social welfare systems are one area where I think not only do a lot of emerging economies in the world are beginning to really seriously develop these systems, but it's a system which has been stress tested massively as a result of the pandemic. My hope in our discussion today is not just to recognize and respect the losses we have gone through, but also as we think about social protection, think through some of the opportunities, some of the lessons that we have learned during the pandemic, and some of the opportunities that may be coming, which hopefully will lead us to more resilient, more socially informed, more socially aware economies and societies. With that, what I'm going to do is the structure of the panel is we'll have each of the panelists speak for about 5 to 6 minutes with some opening statements based on their experience over the last couple of years. And honestly, a lot of the panelists have been working in these areas for the last couple of decades. And so draw on that experience. And then once they've sort of spoken, we'll open for a discussion amongst the panelists, which I will moderate, and then we'll open up to you, the audience. I'd encourage you to start typing your questions in the Q&A feature. We will try our best to get to as many questions as we can, but the sooner you type them, the easier it will be for us to be able to moderate them. The order of the speakers is going to be Rema Hanna first, who's a colleague of mine, someone who I have learned tremendously from, especially in terms of thinking through seriously large-scale welfare systems. Rema will be followed by Darno, who's been a leader in the Indonesian space in terms of some really big momentous decisions they've made. So I'd love to hear then from Darno, both about his experience as an economist and a researcher himself, but very much his experience as someone who's been embedded in the policymaking world, especially in Indonesia, which, as we all know, has faced some of the biggest challenges that many countries have seen. And then the third speaker will be Stéphane, who's at the School of Public Health at Harvard. And Stéphane has thought a lot about both the health side, but also thinking through issues like universal health coverage and universality in welfare systems. And so I'd be thrilled then to turn over to Stéphane. So with that, let me just hand over directly to Rema. Rema, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Asim, for organizing it, and thank you to the CID team. I know a lot of work went into organizing this and having us all come together to talk about these important topics, and so I'm really glad to be here. I want to, I could talk for hours and hours on this topic, but I want to frame some of the discussion that we're going to be talking about today in terms of the 3 questions that were posed to me prior to this panel. The first one is, what has been the biggest loss of social welfare created by the pandemic? Now, on one hand, the social losses look very similar to what we would expect in a global economic downturn. While poverty has been, decreasing during the last 20 years, it's been really dramatic and really wonderful. We've seen, upticks in poverty in the last 2 years. We've seen job loss, and particularly different types of people losing their jobs, given the conditions of the global economic conditions. And so, for example, a lot of like the tourism industry or some of the types of services where there's been a lot of growth into the middle class have been really hit. So there's one hand, we have these economic conditions that are causing poverty now. And then we also worry that, when kids grow up in poverty, that helps generate intergenerational poverty. And so we're worried both about the effects today, but then the effects on the long run. But what makes this pandemic, I think, for me, very different is the fact that in addition to this, to the poverty issues, there's in many countries around the world, schools have been shuttered. You can see like Uganda, India, Indonesia, due to the global pandemic, schools have been shut for many months, in some cases, almost 2 years. And you're going to see kids who, maybe kids who are, 15, 16, who are not going to get a high school degree, which we know has big impacts and returns on wages because they've left and are not going to come back. And we're going to have, 5 and 6 year olds who left school. Maybe you get them back. If you get them back, is the learning environment going to be the same? They've been out of school for 2 years. A lot of the skills you learn about being able to sit and focus and to learn, and maybe there's a lot of loss there. And I think it's something to be thinking about. Now, the second question was, what have been some signs for hope? Here I really do think there's, I've been really impressed. There's been an amazing creativity. I think governments have this really big problem. On one hand, there's the global economic crisis, which means that things like tax revenues are down. Everybody wants money, so it's hard to borrow because everybody's trying to borrow. Rich countries were also hit, so they have less aid money to give, or maybe they've turned inward into focusing on some of their own issues as well. And so you've got limited resources, but you've also need to be able to get out assistance and aid to your citizens really quickly. And so I think there's been a lot of creativity of people trying to use and improve upon existing systems in order to get assistance out. So that's, I'm hoping Darno will talk about some of the work Indonesia has done in that sense, which has been incredibly creative about using different types of targeting methodologies, different types of new programs built into their existing systems to aid the poor. There's also been a lot of trying to use new technologies. And again, I'm going to also turn to you, Asim. I know Pakistan, for example, tried to use a lot of the digital technologies and trying to get more people signed up for aid. And I think a lot of this creativity about trying to find the right people to help in new ways has been very impressive. Okay, so I know I'm probably taking up most of my time. I want to talk quickly about the lessons learned. I think there's a few things for me. The first is that the systems really matter. During the crisis, a lot of governments got creative about being able to help their citizens, but there were foundations in place that they were able to build off of. And if there weren't, it caused a lot of problems. And so I do think, there's often, there's a focus on social protection when times are bad, but the truth is we should be building the systems when times are good so that they're available when we have the bad times and we can react quickly. The second is that I do think then these systems need to be adaptive, and they need to be able to shift in terms of the types and amounts of aid they're able to give out, and to be able to find new people and add people and take people off when they don't need assistance anymore. Be really flexible such that you can target aid to people who really need help. The third is that I do think there's a inwardness that's happening right now, and particularly Stéphane, I'd love to hear from you in terms of there's this inwardness in terms of rich countries, the health situation, and how but at the same time, the health situation in other countries also affect us as well. And so I'd love to bring that forth in terms of the discussion. And then the final thing that I'll note is on schools. I do think it's a big issue. I think people right now, schools are starting to reopen, which are fabulous in many countries. I think we need to think carefully about what are the kind of supporting programs that we need to make sure that kids can catch up. So if you have kids that are, 15 to 16, how do we make sure to attract them back and get that high school degree? If you've got 5 or 6 year olds, there's a temptation to just stick them back into the old grade they were in. But, there's been all this research done on the last decade about having, to teach at the right level is really important in terms of making sure kids learn. And so how do you make sure that the learning losses are not compounded over time? And so that's, I'll end here.
Great, thank you, Rema. That was amazing. One of the things I want to come back to, Rema, you raised something really interesting. I've never thought of it that way, but it makes a lot of sense once you said it that way, which is we always think of counter-cyclical fiscal policy, and to the audience, what that means is basically when things are good, you should save so that when things are bad, you can spend. But I heard Rema saying something interesting, which is kind of counter-cyclical systems building policy. which is when times are good, build up your system so that when times are bad, you can respond in real time. I think that's really fascinating. I'd love to, Rema, explore that kind of when we think of welfare systems in a macro sense. But also you said something else, which I know is something you teach in the center EPoD that you run, which is about learning systems and how do you create adaptive and learning systems. So I'm hoping to come back to both of those questions. You know, how do you create counter-cyclical investment in building systems up? And then how do you make them be adaptive and learning as opposed to kind of rigid rule-based sort of systems? And so it'd be really interesting to hear your thoughts on that. With that, let me turn to Darno. Floor is yours, Darno.
Thank you, Asim. First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me. I'm grateful and delighted to share my story. Although my story mainly is about Indonesia, but I believe it will also be relevant for the countries with a similar level of development, such as the Philippines or Vietnam. So my story started in 1998 during the Asian financial crisis, when our economy collapsed, pushed Sudarno out of power, and poverty increased very dramatically from 11% to about 24%. Since then, Indonesia has been doing quite good, making a lot of progress. Poverty has reached a single digit by 2018, which is a big success story from the current government. However, poverty increased through the pandemic by about 0.5 percentage point, or about 1.3 million new poor people. And this has wiped out Indonesia's poverty reduction effort during the last 3 years. In addition, 3/4 of Indonesian families experience a fall in income, and half of the workers who switch job move into informal sector. With this increased vulnerability, households have experienced food insecurity double from about 5% to close to 11% in November 2020. This is based on study by my colleague at the Sumarto Research Institute. Also, study by our office at the National Team for the Acceleration of Poverty Reduction shows that the pandemic's impact was actually not gender neutral, since the reduction in eating frequency, for example, was more common among female-headed households. Additionally, the pandemic's impact may stretch into the future. A recent study, again by my colleague at Sumarto, shows that disruption to learning occur to about 60% of families with school-age children who did not have stable internet connection to participate in the online learning. And this could potentially lead to learning loss that now we are still investigating about how big is that. In terms of your second question, what have been some sign of hope for social welfare in response to the effort? And to mitigate the pandemic's negative impact, in 2020, the government rolled out a special budget to broaden its social assistance programs, both in size and also in scope, to the existing social protection programs such as conditional and unconditional cash transfer, health assistance, food distribution, especially in the broader Jakarta, because there was a shortage of supplies at that time. In addition, we also introduced an ad hoc program such as the village cash transfer, electricity subsidies for 31 million families, and job training programs to reach those beyond the bottom 40% in our current social registry. And the value of the existing program has also been increased, while targeting, as Professor Rema already mentioned, for additional non-regular program are targeted using a mixed methods like a community-based targeting. This is for the village cash transfer. This is also based on the study done by Rema and EPoD many years ago, published in the AER, about the importance of involving community in targeting those in the bottom 10% of the population. We also used administrative data for those working in the formal sector, especially those with salary less than 5 million a month, for additional about 4 months assistance. And we also use an innovative program called pre-employment card using self-targeting. This is a project that we are currently working also with Professor Rema. Government also introduced assistance for the small and medium enterprises. In total, we spent, prior to the crisis, we spent about 0.85% of our our GDP for social protection, translated into about 134 trillion rupiah, to about 1.6% from GDP, which is about 250 trillion. This is a lot of money. And our colleague from Semeru estimated that 75% of the potential effect of the pandemic on poverty has been mitigated by the social protection program. It still have been about poverty increased by about 4 percentage points instead of 0.3 percentage point. That's based on some of our counterfactual analysis. And the good news is that our economy has slowly recovered. Last year, our third quarter annually grew about 3.4%. Poverty fell slightly, but still higher than pre-pandemic process. And finally, in terms of the lesson learned that we can take away from this exercise, at least there are three. Number one is that the dynamic social register is needed so that benefit could be dispersed more accurately and efficiently. This entails expanding the coverage of the existing social safety net to those beyond poor 40%, because everybody got hit, even those who usually work in the formal sector. And this will allow government to institute a more flexible social protection system that allow coverage to be expanded during the shock. This is our metaphor of a safety net and safety rope that I have written with Professor Len Pritchard about 15 years ago in a newspaper. Secondly, while the COVID-19 social safety net program are set to end soon, there is a need to keep protecting vulnerable groups, especially women, disabled, elderly, children, and those who are vulnerable to receive the social assistance. And finally, acknowledging the government's limited resources, there is a need to also engage with the local actors, private sector, NGOs in social protection program implementation. And lastly, I think this is the importance of using evidence, whatever is available, even everybody is in rush, that we have to respond quite quickly, but we have learned a lot. I think this is the importance of knowledge generation, knowledge production from colleagues in the universities like Harvard or MIT or everywhere in the world, so that it's no perfect evidence, but at least that's what we can use to mitigate this, perfect storm that everybody is actually not well prepared about this pandemic. So with that, I will end my brief introduction, Asim, and happy to continue discussion. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Darno. That's a very, very powerful comments at the end. I'd like to come back to something tied to what Rema said, and I'm sort of just mentioning this so we can sort of thinking about this as a group. You have raised a very exciting vision in many ways for saying, look, we need to expand support. So it's not just people below a certain line or above a line, it's going to be much more expanded coverage. You've argued for continuing support, but at the same time, you've acknowledged that this, if anything, is a fiscal crunch. Countries are struggling on the fiscal space. And so everything that you're saying requires, if anything, more resources at a time when we have less resources. And I think you have given us a way out, but I want us to explore that when we come back to discussion, which is partnerships, which is the idea of drawing in on informal communities, on other sectors, perhaps the private sector. I don't know if you explicitly said that, but I'm putting words in your mouth on that as well. Is there corporate responsibility that we can be done at a national level? I know Indonesia had some amazingly successful business leaders. Some of them are actually in the government. And so how do we think about drawing them? And then the third group you've said is the academy researchers and kind of bringing them in. So I'd love to explore in this tight budget space with expanded objectives, even more ambitious objectives, how do we begin to use partnership, especially tying to Rema's systems kind of thinking to say, how do we incorporate them into the system as opposed to some outsiders? So I'd love to have you think, you've been a bridge your entire life between those worlds. And so I'd love to think more seriously about that. Let me now turn to Stéphane. Over to you.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Asim, and thank you for organizing the event and inviting me to exchange with my colleagues here. Well, first of all, I'll start by saying that it's really hard to anticipate what the full impact of COVID-19 will be on social welfare. And what we're seeing right now is gonna unfold over decades, really. Prior to COVID already, inequalities within countries were large and in many instances increasing. And COVID has only been a revelator of this, really, and perhaps only accelerated already existing trends. And the inequalities I'm talking about are particularly acute for human capital, education, and health. Rema has already mentioned this, but with school closures, millions of children worldwide have not been able to advance their learning. Many have dropped out, and there's a fair percentage that won't go back to schools, especially young girls. And evidently the poor have been affected the most. So this is, as was said by my colleagues here, this is going to happen over generations. Now, health-wise, the poor have been most impacted by COVID with greater mortality rates. We all know this. But beyond those direct effects, we're also seeing, or will see, numerous, perhaps worse, non-direct COVID effects, decreases in people utilizing essential health services, especially among the poor and those marginalized by health systems. I'm thinking about maternal care services, immunization services. We've seen, and we're going to see more, probably increases in incidence in diseases of poverty, malaria, TB, drops in immunization rates leading to outbreaks of deadly vaccine preventable diseases. Think about measles. I think now everybody knows what a reproductive number is. Measles reproductive number is 16. So not vaccinating for measles is deadly, with case fatality risks, which can be up to a few percentage points for severely malnourished children. So the picture is not looking great. Now, maybe a few signs of hope from my side. The first is, I think that this pandemic really demonstrated that social protection and public services, when working well, do not operate in silos. We lived all of this together across many countries. For countries, we saw that health performances were better where social and health services were integrated. In fact, actually, in many countries, the Ministry of Health includes solidarity in its own name. And recall, and I think direct health investments are just one means of redistributing taxpayer money and reducing inequalities. What works are concerted efforts across sectors. Just one example, directly tied to this pandemic, sick leaves are essential, but they are not the responsibility of the health ministry. Also, as we all know, many health outcomes are determined outside of the health system. As I always say to students, good roads can prevent injuries. The so-called sin taxes can prevent smoking or initiating smoking, reduce smoking consumption or consumption of sugary drinks. Healthy foods, physical exercise can prevent NTD risks, etc., etc. These are all good interventions that are actually not actioned by the health minister. So my point here is that because of the pandemic, people, I think, now understand that intersectoral approaches are extremely powerful, and we can really build on this lesson. And perhaps in the exchanges, I can come back to a few examples. So I think that if these lessons are really learned, then the second hope is for realization, hopefully, at last, that current levels of inequalities are simply not sustainable. I mean, they were not ethical in the first place, but COVID made it clear they were not pragmatic either, right? Nationally, internationally. Now, inequalities are not COVID's creation. COVID accelerated those. We knew already that the middle classes, middle income classes were shrinking already, that the gaps were already at work, but COVID really put it at the forefront. And in my view, it's really asking questions about the very social contract between the citizens and the elected in societies, which has a whole bunch of political repercussions that we have seen already and that we're seeing and we will be seeing. So that in short, inequality reduction cannot be avoided. And I think there is some hope that now, and that's especially essential in health, that it can now practically serve as a guiding principle for really setting public policies and health policies. So now moving forward, in short, a few avenues. I think we must design public and health policies with a major purpose of reducing inequalities. And reducing, Darno just said, we have limited budget and limited fiscal space. Reducing inequalities efficiently and cost effectively. You know, how much poverty, how do I prioritize certain interventions which have the biggest return on investment from a poverty reduction standpoint? And the question about where it comes from, whether it's the health guy, the education guy, or the social protection guy, might be a secondary item. Now, if you think about health, that means implementing health interventions that maximize equity, reduce disparities, increase financial protection per dollar invested. That should be at the core of health insurance design. That should be at the core of universal health coverage and essential benefit package design. Health investments, in other words, take full part in the general social, or should take full part in the general social protection welfare agenda. And so in economic terms, the opportunity cost of health investments may not solely fall on the health sector budget, but also perhaps in the broader public social welfare budget. And I think that's really where we've seen, you know, countries that do best often have these integrated thinking. And then lastly, what I would say is, as I mentioned earlier, is that obviously financial consequences of illness, productivity losses, wages lost, and so on, of a great number of conditions or effective and cost-effective interventions to prevent this condition lie outside the health sector. We have to think about intersectoral interventions, integrated public health and social protection systems, rather than the solely clinical care system. You know, maybe we focus on the healthy rather than the sick individual. And for instance, investing in school-based interventions where we can reach hundreds of millions of children, you know, those schools as a delivery platform can be, and that's one example among many others, can be a very promising avenue and promising example for intervening for health and other things.
Great, Stéphane, that was amazing. I'm pleasantly surprised how coordinated all of your views are, which is great. It makes my job as a moderator a lot easier. Let me actually do something a bit more unusual. Normally at this point, I would pose several different questions to you and get a discussion going. I just want to pose one question because I think it's coming out from everything you were saying. And I want us to take maybe the next 10 to 15 minutes, see if it's even possible, to build, to respond to this question. And let me pose a question. The question is very much started with what Rema said, which is the systems way of thinking. And the reason I'm saying this is, Stéphane, each one of you in my mind have given us different properties that the system needs to satisfy. And what I want us to try and start beginning to do is to say, how do we construct that system, right? And so let me just rehash. So Stéphane, you said something in addition to what I heard from Rema and Sudarno, which I agree with, is you said this system also needs to be intersectoral, cross-sectoral. You cannot think of health just as health. A better road means better health. And if anything, I think in the pandemic, we saw this. We saw that health policy had direct implications on education policy, on industrial policy, and vice versa. Opening schools or opening businesses had huge implications on the pandemic. You've also talked about kind of this relationship over time. And you raised a really scary, and I hadn't thought of it before, but you've made me really scared, which is this infectious disease could have had multiplier effects on promoting other infectious diseases because the precautionary things we had in place in our systems, vaccination may have dropped. So if there's a measles outbreak, God forbid, what can that look like? So there's a sense in which we need coordination, not just across different ministries, but coordination over time as well, thinking through the implications of what our decisions now have on future sectors, which may not even be our sectors, right? And so I'd love to kind of start having us build this. So let me start with Rema, because I'm going to pose the hardest question to Rema first, but I want us to try and build on this. So the exercise is, can we construct a system? By the way, I should add one other thing, Rema, that Stéphane added. He wants the system to be very cost effective and efficient as well. right? And so can you start us off constructing a system like that? And then I'd love Darno and Stéphane to kind of add to this system and see where we go. By the way, there's some questions on technology, Rema, as well. So as you build this system, if you can have us think through that, that would be amazing. So
yeah, no, in fact, technology was going to be the first thing I was going to start with. So I completely agree that you want systems in place that are coordinated, and that you do want to be thinking about social protection, not just as like a cash transfer, wage subsidy, but you want to be thinking about the intersection between education, human capital development, health, and so forth. And I think, the one guiding principle as you build a system that, many countries are in the world are at different stages of development is even just having a registry of who the citizens are. And, this is really challenging to do because it is, on one hand, you want a list of who everybody is, because so that this way you can actually reach them and find them and provide assistance to them. There's a worry that the poor are often left off these lists because they might not necessarily be as connected to society. The government might not have an incentive to find them as much as maybe middle-class voters who are voting and so forth. So there's that. But then there's also this issue of how do you update this list as things change oftentimes. Oftentimes there's an investment where countries create ID systems, but then there's not the local mechanisms in place to update the data over time and to make this data accessible to different ministries to be able to use this to think about how to provide coordinated social services. I think the other thing I would add on, there's a real challenge in this, is on one hand, you want to have these data systems in place and have a record of everybody and their information. You want to make it available to different ministries so that there can be coordination. There's also, though, we've seen in many countries a danger of this information and this data being used in bad ways. And so then you also need to think about the legal structures and protections in place, particularly as governments change, over how do you think about having these underlying data systems and architecture. And I think these are really complex questions that many countries are grappling with right now. But I do think that's an important aspect of how do we even deliver social services, particularly if you want to deliver more targeted social services, we need to know who to target. So I would start with there.
By the way, we should all unmute because at this point we should just jump in. Rema has started us off with building a solid underlying database with obviously privacy protection as just it seems like, Rema, you were saying that's just a necessary condition. If you're going to build a system, you have to start first by knowing who your who your population is, and not just knowing. You've made it more challenging by saying you need to keep updating it. You can't just build a system and then say, oh, we have this data, it's cool. And you've said you need the information to be usable and accessible by practitioners. So Darno, can I have
just
you
to give an example?
Yeah.
Oh, I was going to, and then actually I was going to give this side example on the updating. So for example, in Indonesia, on a project Darno and I worked on together, there's a universal health insurance system. It's challenging to sign up. And we did this project where we tried to get people to sign up online through the online systems. And lots of people wanted to sign up for the health insurance, but it was nearly impossible to because of the underlying data architecture and the computer systems was not updated. And then that was really difficult to figure out how to update it. And so by then people lost interest and they were busy with other things and they didn't actually sign up for the health insurance. And so this thing about not just creating these lists, but having them be dynamic are really important, both for getting people social services, but also being able to update them over time. I don't know, but I should turn it over to Darno to talk more.
Darno, you want to jump in? Especially, I'd love to hear, Darno, from your experience on not just setting up these systems, because there's some questions about practically give us examples of what's happened and what succeeded, but also how do you get government officials, decision makers to start using these systems?
That's a great question, Asim. I think that's the problems, the silence that has been faced by many, many countries in developing countries. I think Indonesia set an example where we established the so-called the national theme for the acceleration of poverty reduction under the office of the vice president. Is the very reason was actually to overcome the silence across line ministries. For example, when we talk about COVID-19, this is not only about health, but it's also about many other things. So when the economic minister would like to, opening up economy-wide opening, but they didn't consider how important is health also need to be considered. So I think the storyline that I would like to share with you is Indonesia has been in the frontier in terms of building the institution to coordinate better. So this national theme for poverty reduction is actually headed by the Vice President himself. I've been advising this office for the last 10 years by the Executive Secretary, and the memberships include the Economic Minister, Health Minister, Education Minister. So we know about siloness. Even so, this is not always successful because Indonesia is a very democratic country. The ministers also come from the different political parties. Sometimes it's not easy to handle this, bickering and also competition across the political parties. But I think the very reason when we established this in 2010, at that time I was doing my sabbatical at Stanford, I came back and then Vice President Budiono called me up. Darno, can you help me working for the national team? So the Professor Budiono was the Vice President in 2010 to establish this institution. The very reason is actually to overcome, the issue that you just brought up about the siloness, about sectoral approach that did not recognize the importance of the interconnect, not across the subject that we are actually currently facing, poverty, inequality, health, education issues. So basically, that's the lesson that we have been, learn a lot lately. And we, many countries in Asia, from Africa came to Indonesia to learn about how we set up this, a body under the Vice President directly to coordinate effort in mitigating the social ill. And now we are developing the stunting program, which also actually by Vice President office. This is a completely a multi-sectoral approach because stunting, underweight is not only about health, but also about nutrition, about sanitation. So we're working with the Ministry of Public Works and education for things like that. So I think this is, my story is real and it's not perfect, but actually we recognize about the problem that we are having right now in many countries.
Darno, can I follow up just on one thing you said there? It was fascinating. In many countries, because of COVID, there was COVID central response task forces that get set up, which were by definition intersectoral for the reasons you said. In my experience, while I've been very impressed by some of these task forces, I can see alignment at the high levels. Even that's challenging, as you said, politics comes in, national versus regional politics comes in. What I haven't seen as much is coordination at the lower levels of bureaucracy. Do the line people in health talk to the line people in education, right? Is that something that is not needed because you can just hope on kind of trickle up coordination? Or do you need to also build linkages at kind of every level of the hierarchy? If you can kind of speak a bit to that and tell us what your experience has been.
Yes, I think that's exactly what we have been trying to do to, in addition to the national theme that under the Vice President, we also have the, the task force of the COVID task force at the central government, also provincial and also regional government. During this kind of stress and distress situation, the effectiveness, the efficiency of coordination is not always successful because of so many political parties, interested parties are involved in this. But I think our president has been very practical. So this is the first time in the history of Republic where the Minister of Health is actually a banker. Used to be working at Citibank and also the manager of one of the largest bank in Indonesia is my colleague also used to be working under the state-owned enterprises. So we would like to deploy everything very fast in terms of vaccination, in terms of quarantine, and to have a very strict policy. Even though his deputy minister is actually a medical doctor, but for years it's always a medical doctor who headed that department. So this is just to show how important it is to better coordinate across line ministries, but also between central and regional government, because we know that Indonesia is one of the most decentralized country in the world. With about 550 district municipalities in Indonesia, which sometimes is very hard to coordinate. But I think so far we are doing good. I think Indonesia has been an example of relatively well in protecting our society from this COVID-19, especially recently. I think we have a strict rule about, quarantine, about opening up school and also business facilities.
I want to bring Stéphane in as well. Stéphane, something you said this, so I'm going to put it back to you, which is we've had coordination being responded to. I think some great ideas here. I want to take cost effectiveness of this system, the leanness of this system. And I want to add one other thing that Rema raised, that being in the School of Public Health, I'm sure you're very familiar with this idea of privacy. Like the people who've really thought carefully about privacy is very much in health, both because you've had experiences of dealing with very private data and sadly some really bad situations where data was abused and patients were abused and trials were abused. And so you have a much richer history of what went wrong and how to deal with it. And I want to hear a bit from you, both on cost effectiveness, but also keeping patient privacy or in general citizen privacy protected while you can still use data. How do you go about doing that?
You're asking me a very easy question.
Totally. I started with the easiest one for Rema. That's a fun thing of being a moderator. You can pose all these questions and not have to answer them yourself.
No, great. No, it's a great question. I wanted also to rebound a little bit on what was said, the excellent points that were raised by Darno and Rema on the data systems, which gets a little bit sideways to your question. And then maybe I'll say one thing about intersectional. I think this is very, very important, the data systems. And what's very important is actually locally generated data, locally generated analysis and evidence. And I think that my observation, at least I'll mention the observation of Ethiopia, is that not specifically for COVID, but I think that what I've observed is that when there's locally collected data, when that exists, and locally generated evidence, whether it's a number of reports here and there, as well as analysis, there's really stronger buy-in for implementation. That really than borrowing from evidence from other countries. And I think that's very important. I think in many ways, where we can have the biggest impact is really about strengthening local capacities, really developing the capacity of, as Rema said, data systems in generating evidence. And I'll mention again, the case in Ethiopia, there's at the Ministry of Health, there's a health economics unit that has certain agendas and set priorities. And then more recently with that was prior COVID, but the defining of the essential benefits package, there was a commission that really set up and really digged into collecting information and really trying to find evidence and so on. So that's for the data front. And I think that, I mean, obviously, which I will answer your question by taking a sideway, Asim.
I've noticed a pattern over here, Stéphane.
No, that's fine. I like to do that anyways. So I think what's really, in terms of data, just building on that, because I think this is very, very important. Taking the health perspective, I think in health, we only, and that's, I mean, that's synergistic with what I've said before. I think we're really used to health data, right? And I don't think we look too much about non-health data. What I mean by that is that, well, I am not going to seek care if I don't have a road or transportation means next to me. And I think that it goes a little bit with what I was saying with working in silos, is that I think that there are today lots of information we can have. They are not necessarily the typical demographic and health surveys that are collected every 5 years. They are maybe non-survey based. Maybe they get more with, stepping on the privacy and so on. And we should absolutely have safeguard for that. But I think this is really, in terms of when we think about intervening, which I think is very consistent with what my colleagues were saying, I think we need to think about a whole bunch of kinds of data. And what I'm saying is just the obvious. They are social determinants, they are contextual, environmental determinants of health that just, take the health perspective that we should really draw from. And I think that's where, coming back to my intersectoral point, I think that's where really by strengthening those data locally, investing in capacity building training the next generation of analysts, whether they're academics in local universities or in ministries, and trying to teach them to think about intersectoral, and that comes with a plethora of data that are perhaps not the usual data that us as analysts and academics we always dig into.
One thing, I want to come back quickly, and we're going to open up very quickly for the general Q&A. There's some really fabulous questions that I'm going to try my best to kind of do justice to. Before we do that, I want a quick kind of lightning response from you, which is also good practice for you, because I want the same response for the Q&A so that we can try and get as many questions in. My quick thing, so we've talked data systems and partnerships within the government, or sort of coordination within the government. I just want a quick 30-second response from each of you about partnerships beyond the government. And here's just what I want to, who is your first priority to partner with, and any ideas on how do we do that with the government? So let me start in reverse order. Stéphane, I'm going to start with you and then kind of go in reverse order.
Yes, excellent question. So I think that there are two things to think of here. I think that obviously you want independence, but you also want to have a say in action. So I think it's a difficult question, and it's a difficult balance where, on the one hand, you want to have the analytical strength, analytical power. So that is the role of universities. And I think, just to build on what I've just said, I think that's really where you want to invest the most, really having, and hopefully Harvard has a lot to do with it. Having PhD training, master's level training, and so on, and really build the next level of professors. That is one thing. Now, if that, which I was taking the example of within ministry priority setting, okay, I think if you're too remote from where the decisions are, I think that then it might be difficult to act on the findings of the analysis and so on. So I think that so there's that, and I think on the other side, that means that from the governmental perspective and so on, or from investing within governments, I think you do want to have strong analysts that can critically assess the kinds of information that are generated, and that try to work in hand with, I would say, the academics are perhaps the most inclined analysts that should be involved in producing evidence. But I think there's this fine balance, which is close to policy making, so that it's really not only you're asking the right question, but also the questions or the answers you try to provide are actually linked to perhaps action. And so I think it's an iterative process. You're not going to ask good academic questions if you are totally excluded from the field, and conversely, I think that there's not going to be actions. So just maybe that few things on my side on this. Yeah.
Darno.
Okay, thank you, Asim. So I think before I joined with the national team under the vice president, I established an institution called the Sumarto Research Institute that was coming out of the crisis in '98. Where Len Pritchard and several colleagues are helping establish that one. I think the role of the, a think tank and research organization, independent but credible. We don't want to be, making a lot of noise, but actually our analytic should be going straight to the government and also engaging with the local partners, NGOs and activism. Because many of them actually would like to help, would like to work together in fighting social ill, but sometimes they don't have enough evidence or knowledge or understanding, and also working with the CSO. For example, right now, Sumarto Research Institute is actually helping one of the biggest company in Indonesia through their CSR with the, they would like to have the zero poverty in the areas where they are working on, in Sumatra, for example, or in Riau. So basically, there are a lot of partners out there potentially that can be empowered working with in terms of doing the analytic, but also that analytic can be used for, policy making process at the central and also local government. So that's why the government comes and go, power comes and go. I think the institute, like independent one, like the Smith Research Institute and several other organizations at the local levels remain exist because they produce a good quality research that can be used and it's relevant for policy making process. So I'm not sure if I answer your question because I'm also in between, third sector, but also in the government. So basically, the bottom line is that we need to have a good analytic, and that is also matters for policy making process.
Well, this is great.
Thank you.
Rima, I want your response. As you respond, Rima, can you also talk about the private sector just briefly?
Yeah, I was going to do that as well. So I agree. So I'm going to talk about two different aspects and respond to your question about both the private sector as an NGO. So I believe it's super, super important to include activists who are and civil societies who are trying to advocate for particular groups, particularly if they're advocating for a lot of minority groups that don't have a lot of voice. I think it's important and critical to include the private sector and business in the decisions, because in the end, many people are working there, they have huge impacts on the economy, and you want to make sure that what you're doing is both favorable to citizens, but also business. But I do think you have to engage government for several reasons. First, just the scale. If you want to reach many people at once, the way to do it is through government institutions. Two, resources. So for example, even if you want to work with companies or to provide incentives to do, you want to provide health insurance to companies, you want to do that side by side with the government to think about kind of incentives and plays and the role of both in terms of those kind of actions. And I do think the third thing is the legal and regulatory framework, that oftentimes companies and activists and have a lot of great ideas and they want to do things, but how do you make sure that regulatory process is there, that they're able to do it? And so that's why I think it's important to engage all the partners. And so I just want to note that, given I know there are a lot of students on here as well, that's why I think it's important. I love the Kennedy School students. They're such wanting to do public service and public good. And I think it's really, really incredible. But I think in terms of when we think about your career in public service, that oftentimes moving between public and private, moving between nonprofit and government, learning about different aspects of the process can help have a more enriched sense of public service. And I think that's something that we often don't talk about as much in terms of thinking about ways to have a new way of thinking about public service, including lots of different actors. And I think it's something that we should think about more moving forward.
Great, Arima, thank you. Let me now switch gears and go down to this speed response session we're going to start. Faye has done already an incredible job of making my life easy by grouping questions. So what I'm going to do is, with your permission, I'm just going to direct groups of questions to each one of you. If you feel like you want to answer a question from a group I gave someone else, feel free to jump in when your turn comes. I'm just going to go sequentially, just in the interest of time. So what I'm going to do is, for the panelists, you have the questions in your session, so you can read as I'm going along. I'm going to read quickly some of the gist of these questions, just to acknowledge the people who've posted in for the rest of the audience. So the first one, I'm going to turn to you, Rima, which is this idea of how do you think of social welfare more broadly. There's a question from Amrita Dini at the Ministry of Villages in Indonesia, a question from Carlos Miranda from the Instituto Nacional de Derechos Humanos, and from Pratiti Ghosh from Jadavpur University. And these questions are sort of about deeply defining. So one question is about, how do you think of changing poverty? Should we be thinking of changing poverty? Second is social welfare very much a privilege of rich countries? And then how do we overcome inequality in the system? I also want to add one question from Stephanie Chan from the US Department of Labor, and I want to kind of direct that to you, Rima, as well, is how can what we're talking about be applied to underserved US communities as well? And I know you've thought about marginal communities, obviously in developing, but you've actually thought about marginalized communities in the US as well. And so if you could kind of put those four questions together and have some joint response, and then I'll turn to you.
That could be like an entire several semesters.
I know this is a whole course for you, Rima. I know
but
that.
I will try to answer quickly. So I don't think improving social welfare to just be for luxury rich countries. I think we need to make choices and invest in the future, and social protection, particularly when it's enlarged, to think about its intersection with education and health and development of human capital and productivity, I think is really important. Not just thinking about not just thinking about people living in poverty today and our moral obligation, but also thinking about intergenerational poverty. And in fact, a lot of work is really nice work from the historical US. And then also some of my own work in Indonesia with members of Stéphane Verguet, which Sudarno mentioned, and some other countries from Mexico, showing how social protection policies have effects on intergenerational poverty and are starting to, it's an investment. And so I think it's important, and it's an important investment, not just for rich countries, but it has to be for poor countries too. The last thing I'll mention, I do think there's a lot of, it's very interesting. There's a lot of interesting sort of ways about we think about social protection in the US. In many ways are very similar in emerging and developing countries. So for example, they're sending out the testing kits right now. And a lot of people in homeless shelters couldn't get a testing kit because they were including a housing unit as the unit of the targeting. And so like different families within were locked out. These really vulnerable families locked out of getting testing kits. And this is a challenge in developing countries. You target at the household, at the family level. So there's lots of synergies in terms of how we reach marginalized groups in terms of the problems. And that's why I think there should be more discussion. And so I agree with Stéphane. I think we want a lot of locally made solutions, and we want to learn from within and get buy-in from within. But I think there's also a lot we can learn from each other, because humanity is humanity, and we face a lot of universal challenges. And how do we put the two together to really thrive is, I think, extremely important. And I'll stop here because I see Asim like, get off the stage, get off the stage.
Rema knows me too well. My body language gives me away all the time. Darno, I want to turn this kind of policy reform system questions to you, these next set of questions. Let me just quickly read them, and as I'm reading them, you can look through them as well. The first one is from Burak Eskici, sorry if I mispronounced your name. Who is the agent that can build this integrated, comprehensive system for social protection? So who are you talking about? Who's going to actually create this system? Naveen Jha wants to know whether there are examples from of some of the suggestions you've made. You've mentioned some of them, but maybe talk a bit more from the Indonesian experience, things you're really proud of that worked well, and perhaps ones that didn't work as well. And then this kind of to Rema's counter-cyclical approach, is that feasible, Darno? Do you think that's possible in good times when the pandemic is all done and we're happy to say, okay, let's prepare for the next crisis? Is that politically feasible or not?
Thank you. I think that's all a great question. I'm not sure if I can address all of them, but on the agents, who is the agent, I think this requires a lot of partnership, I think, but the key is actually should be coming from the leadership, from the government about, what is, I think Stéphane mentioned about the social contract, about the importance of, what is the role of government is actually protecting their citizen. I think that's what has been the agent of change in Indonesia when we established this national team for coordinated effort. Is actually the vice president himself, after talking with the World Bank, with many scholars about the importance of having coordinated effort. So, of course, government cannot do it alone. I think you already mentioned about the importance of, partnering with the local, partnering with the private sector, and we've been trying to do that a lot. And also, that's the importance of unified database that Rema also mentioned, and that can be used not only by the government, but also by the private sector when they would like to help on those poor people. And then in terms of the counter-cyclical, about saving in the good time and spending in the bad time, well, I think Indonesia needs a lot of resources, because we are still developing, many infrastructure, and we also put a ceiling for our deficit, cannot exceed 3% from your GDP. So that's why when the pandemic hit the country, we have to put in the parliament. We cannot do it with this 3% deficit. So we have to raise up to 5 to 6%. And the president sent a letter to the parliament to allow the government, the Minister of Finance, to have more fiscal space to address this the pandemic. So. But I think we have, that's why we have been trying to build a lot of infrastructure with the hope that we will be able to generate more growth, and, because growth is the engine of your saving, of your money, so that you can have a prepare during the bad time to have a more ability to deal with the crisis. But actually, to be frank, Indonesia has been offered by many international donor agencies like the World Bank, like the IMF. If you would like to lend money, we have a lot of facilities for you to, borrow from our organization, but we restrain ourselves because we are still capable of doing it at that time by selling bonds at the local market and also international market. I think that what was the third question?
No, I think you've covered it. That's great.
Okay, but can I also respond?
No, please, yes. If you want to jump in any other question, please do so.
Yeah, I think Amrita is my colleague. Actually, used to work at the Ministry of Health. Now she is the Minister of Village. So the question is it possible to change the way how we measure poverty? So what we are doing with the poverty measurement is actually, this is international standard. This is also done by many other countries. Our benchmark is, using the 2100 kilocalorie per capita per day for your consumption measure, which is also used by the SDG and also the World Bank and also by many other countries. So of course you can always change your measurement, but I think you should have the comparable across time, across space, so that you can measure progress. I think the key is about comparability across time and across space. And the only way to do that if you have the absolute monetary approach. If you have a multidimensional poverty, things like that, that's important, but that's a complementary to the absolute poverty measure that has been applied by many other countries in the world. So I think that's my response to Ibu Amrita on the question. But it doesn't mean that you cannot use a different multidimensionality of poverty. But I think still we have to have a very comparable apple-to-apple yardstick over time. So that's the way how we measure poverty.
Great, thanks, Darno. Stéphane, I'm going to skip some questions. I want to turn these technology set of questions to you, and then obviously feel free to comment on some of the previous ones. So there are two questions posted on sort of this use of technology. One is by Radhika Serene, who says kind of the growth of technology is challenging the functioning of social welfare systems, given unequal access to technology. And so how do you think about that? And also, how do you think of technology as a way of facilitating collaborations? This is from Naveen Cheah, not just in measuring welfare metrics, but also understanding a dynamic situation. So if you can speak a bit to this, and maybe even think a bit, Stéphane, from your own health experience, again, you guys have utilized both of these things and sort of think through how that's worked out.
Yeah, great. No, thanks. Thanks, Asim. So, just on and I'm reading also in the chat on the growth use, absolutely inequalities have been enormous. Just to come back, I'm going to talk about health, but for education, obviously, depending on your socioeconomic status, in many places, you could have access to easily good internet, and then that meant eventually like good online teaching. The same, and I think the same is to be said with health, in which has been in many places thinking about telehealth, for instance, which is that obviously with COVID and the fact that in many places people were either scared or the services were not available, etc., would not seek care, how you could transfer a number of things online. Now, online means very different things, and it means like very different coverage of different services, phone or internet. And then again, there's a huge opportunity here, which is that there are many things, just like getting prescriptions or refills of drugs that can be moved. We don't necessarily need to see a skilled physician and so on to have those. And that can really be cost saving, a lot of economies and so on, and then preventing in the case of pandemics, infections. Now, in the meantime, because of access, who would benefit those? And so in many places, I'm not even talking about necessarily rural areas, there's no good internet coverage. It would be through cell phone, text messages. There's been a lot of thinking, but then it comes at the expense of like perhaps increasing gaps, which were already existing, and then the technology gap add on or widens the health gap. So I think that's something which my observation has been a lot of attention that there's huge potential, but obviously with that efficiency and preventing many other things, there can be side effects around equity, and we should never disregard those. And the second question, I guess, I see the chat as well. What was the second question, Asim?
So second one is just in terms of examples of technology usage, Naveen's question. Any good examples you've seen? In fact, if you could tie this to, there's a last question posted, which is kind of in the Indian experience, if you could respond to both of them. Money is given and accountability is there, but can we use the internet to compile beds? Because individuals help coordination in this and create accountability. So if you could sort of respond to, that's similar to Naveen's questions, if you could respond to that as well. This is by Snigdha Soni from Ambedkar University.
Okay, so just on the use of, very briefly, and I'm also mindful we're reaching time, just very briefly, I think that there's a huge potential here. Just from a data, coming back to the data system, I think we should really invest in data systems, build capacity. And I think computer and technology have a lot, with all the good safeguards with privacy. And in particular, in two ways. One is that assembling a number of, at least coming from the health side, of non-typically health things that, as I was mentioning earlier, I think we undervalue, and that's because we each of us is specialized in one thing, and I think there's a lot of things, and that merging large data sets, making them speak to each other, I think there's a lot to do here, and certainly technology can really help, including, of course, different kinds of modeling that can be done. And I guess I lost my second point. I think that's, I already talked too much.
No, you didn't. This is great. I want to keep going, but let me do one last response from Darno and Rema. Darno, I'm going to post two questions to you. I'm just reading them out. These are questions 5 and 7. If you're looking at the list of questions, these are all about sort of the policy side, if you will. And I want to speak a bit, given your experience here. So. The question from Edwin Ijoama from the Center for Excellence of Scientific Research and Innovation in Africa is, what are the possible policy imperatives that would not only improve service delivery, but also create sustainable platforms that would assist the beneficiaries from fending for themselves? So not just waiting for handouts, but, as you create a welfare system, how do you get self-sufficiency going? And then from Nika Santos is a question about decentralization. Have they been more successful or less successful at coordinating delivery, especially given Indonesia has this big challenge given how spread out you are. So I'd like to think about that spatiality of delivery and the decentralization of delivery. So both these questions back to you.
Thank you. That's a great question. Let me respond to the second one on the decentralization. Actually, there are good stories and bad stories. I cannot generalize about the impact of decentralization, but there are so many districts in Indonesia, or municipalities, who are doing a lot of innovative work. So that's why we are doing now currently study with the RISE, which also headed by Alan Pritchard. There are several districts in Indonesia who are doing a lot of innovative education system, for example, and also innovation in COVID mitigation and also in delivering social assistance better. So I think leaders matter. When it comes to the local leaders, and also the societal pressure. I think I have written a paper about the importance of institution in the district level, which I define institution as the work of the coordination across the subunit within the government. So I think that's what characterizes the working of decentralization. But we cannot generalize whether actually decentralization has a better impact or less in terms of welfare, the functioning of the welfare system. With the second question was about what was the second one? The first one?
Sort of graduating, and I want Rema to respond to this as well.
Okay.
Graduating, not become self-sufficient, becoming self-sufficient.
Yeah, but I also would like to respond to that. Actually, we are currently working on that, exactly that question. Actually, we don't know exactly, because now we are focusing more on in terms of the program. We have two programs. The first one is actually helping poor and vulnerable group by giving cash, social assistance, but we are also trying to empower them, by granting a small asset transfer and things like that. But the evidence has been very scattered, and we don't know where to go about what kind of asset transfer, what is the minimum amount of asset transfer that is sufficient for them to be sustainable in the future. So to be frank, we don't have any credible answer in terms of except with the storyline from the BRAC, for example. I think Rema can add on that one. But I think the key is about bundling. You cannot only just handing asset transfer, but you also have to empower them. You have to, working with them in terms of education and things like that. So it has to be a bundling program, not only just handing in cash and also giving asset transfer, but also empowering them to a different set of inputs.
So Rema, let me give you the last kind of response. So if you could just continue to that, but also respond to this question that Lysander Menezes has from KPMG about connecting social safety nets to livelihood, skilling, and education. I think both are related to this idea of graduating beyond.
Right. So I think on the first question, there's several different components. So first of all, in some of my own work on my own studies, we looked at who are on the conditional cash transfer programs or the cash transfer programs around the world. And we looked at all these RCTs from different countries, these big scale government programs, and whether or not it was disincentivizing work. And what we actually found was that if you looked at it, in all these families, most of the men are working. It's not that they're not working, they're just not earning enough for to get over the poverty line. And it gets back into these issues of inequality and so forth that we've been talking about. And we find no impacts of the top-ups of cash transfers affecting work. And so first of all, again, this is going to design on the amount of money you give and the time frame and how you design these programs and so forth. But the evidence isn't that large that these programs disincentivize. And if anything, what we're starting to see is that a lot of these programs, by providing assistance to families, you see investments being made in kids and having long run effects on intergenerational poverty. So I think first of all, we need to stop thinking about social protection in this like old fashioned way of it disincentivizes work and start thinking about it as an investment in human capital and health capital and education capital and in people. And that connects to the next question as well. I think now there's been starting to be research done about how can we use social protection systems to help people improve their productivity. Some of this is through these combined programs where they give assets and education and some assistance during the process and different types of training. I'm not going to have a chance to talk about all of it, but there's a lot of research that's starting to happen. I think there's a lot more that needs to be done in terms of thinking about how do we help people retool. And I think this is going to be particularly important as we start to see the same trends we see about automation happening in richer countries are happening in developing countries as well. And it might lead to people needing different types of skills in terms of the types of work they do and trying to think through, and COVID, facilitated a lot of the move to digital. And so trying to think through how we can start better designing these programs to help people skill up. And again, I do think that's something that's got to be a combination of both public and private sector because you want to expect jobs. But anyways, I see Asim nodding at me again, so I could talk on and on. But
this is awesome. This is a great segue. You did the best pitch possible for our next session, Rema, which is our next session on March 2nd is on the future of work. And so I think this is a great segue into what will follow. So I'm going to invite you all to please join for that as well. But most importantly, I want to thank the three panelists. This has been a fascinating discussion. I always ask this question in life, was this hour worth spent? For me, it was personally an hour definitely worth spent. I really enjoyed listening to Rema, Sudarno, and Stéphane. I hope you did as well. We will have a recording for this event. We will share with all of you. So please share with others who you think would benefit from this. Thank you again for the three speakers for making the time today. Thank you for the audience for attending and listening to us and for posing some fabulous questions. I hope you all stay safe. We will see you in a few weeks.